For most of you who've listened to my videos know I produce these directly for my class and then post them on YouTube. I will say for this particular lecture, the first 27 minutes or so is not material directly from the textbook. I truly want my students to understand the graphs, charts, and information that is presented and understanding real and nominal GDP. So if you're only looking for textbook material, you might want to jump ahead about 27 minutes to the timestamp for productivity. Otherwise, I hope you do listen to the beginning of the lecture. I do think this is important for students in general to understand how to look at and review data that is presented to you about economics. So let's get started. Now, there are many different ways that we're going to look at prosperity across nations and across the world and production. And this chart is just one way to look at it. I've always just kind of found this interesting, so I thought I'd put it up here for us to start our conversation. Because what this basically diagram is looking at is the entire world's GDP. And how much does each country contribute to the world's GDP? So if the world was one country, you might want to say one global economy, the United States would be contributing the most to that GDP. Now, based on looking at this, you would also say that probably the United States would have the highest standard of living, with China having the second highest standard of living. But there are some things that we always want to look at when we see a chart like this. First of all, notice that this is from 2018. Now, it takes a little time to put these things together, and from the recording of this particular lecture, this was basically the newest material that was available, because you will see that it wasn't published until 2019. Now, this is for the entire year of 2018, and it takes a little time to crunch this data. The other thing you want to always make sure you pay attention to is that this is using nominal GDP, not real GDP. Now, why would we want to use nominal GDP instead of real GDP in this case? Well, that's pretty simple. In this case, we're not comparing from one year to another. We're looking at a snapshot in time. So nominal GDP is quite often good when looking at a snapshot in time. So how does this apply to basically our lecture for this week or for this chapter? Well, that's because we're always asking this question in economists, why do some countries have different rates of growth? Now, I need to be very careful here. The chart that you're looking at, that diagram, is not talking about a rate of growth. It's talking about how much actually a country contributed to the world's GDP. Now, rate of growth would say across time. So if we're talking about across time, we're probably also not going to use nominal GDP. But let's give an example. Why would we want to look at the rate of growth across time? Well, we can look at China versus Zimbabwe. China saw this average growth of about 9% between 1990 and 2017, whereas Zimbabwe saw this decline of an average of 27%. So we would basically be able to say that we're probably seeing China having an increase in their standard of living across that time, where Zimbabwe sees this decline in its standard of living. And so the question is why would there be such a difference between China and Zimbabwe as far as their rate of growth? So if we're again talking about a rate of growth across time, we're going to want to use real GDP because we're measuring based on a base year. So if that base year was, let's say, 2013, we're talking about change from 2013 to 2014 to 2015. And so using real GDP allows us to see a change because we're basing everything on the same core year or base year. Whereas the nominal GDP, that fluctuates so much per year. But at the same point, nominal GDP is really good for the chart that you're seeing here where we're taking a snapshot, you might want to say, in time. Now, what affects the rate of GDP and growth and progress of the country is what we're really going to explore. But for this particular lecture, we're going to be looking at the long-term determinants, not the short-term determinants of levels and rate of growth of real GDP. Let's look at the difference between a snapshot in time versus going across time. So this is a pretty typical chart looking at countries going across time. Now, just in case you don't know what per capita is, generally per capita is a statistical term used to in place of per person, but maybe even more officially we'd say per unit of population. You would have to make sure you understand how they're defining per person, you might want to say, within their countries or within the information you're looking at. In some cases, people won't include children because they say that they're not actually contributing to GDP. In other cases, it may be grouped by sectors, but basically anytime you see per capita, think per person and you're pretty safe. So in this case, we're looking at a chart of real GDP across time. And in this case, just the top 10 as far as production is concerned. And you may be going, Luxembourg? Luxembourg is the highest GDP per person, and the country that has less than 1 million people in it. Really small little European country where many of you may be right now wanting to look on a map where Luxembourg actually is. It's over by Germany, by the way. Now, yes, they have extremely high GDP per person. And notice that they've been pretty high for many, many years. Why? Because one of the main things that they do to create basically productivity in their country is they're a very big banking area in Europe. But you may be surprised by Norway and Iceland and many of the other ones that are on there, thinking that you just saw the United States was this really high country when it came to nominal GDP for 2018. Why aren't we up there, as far as per capita? Well, there's a big difference per person versus how much your entire country produces. And so you would notice that there are countries like Qatar, which actually has been going down. You can see here that it was 69 and now it's 63. So their per capita is actually going down, where other countries like the United States went from 48 to 55 per person, basically. But how different is looking at real GDP across time versus, let's say, nominal GDP across time? Now remember, nominal is current prices. And one of the first things you might have noticed is that China is in this list, but China is not in that list. Why? Because when we look at China across time, as far as real GDP is concerned, they were very low and they've only been growing lately. And so with this, using this as 2010 data, what we're going to find is that based on 2010 versus, today, we're not seeing that they were that high of per capita, per person GDP. So each person producing in. But if we use at today's prices, that means is that when we look at each one of these, it'd be based on 2019 or based on 2015 prices, then we would see that China is up there. But look at the dramatic difference from 66 to 84. That's a pretty big growth, which means that they've had a lot of growth. But their growth rate hasn't been that phenomenal compared to the rest of the world if we use a constant price. So each one of these, real versus nominal, gives us some information. But remember, nominal is like a snapshot for that year versus real, which helps us really compare from one year to another. So let's take a look at a little bit more data charts, and we can see that each one gives us a different sort of viewpoint of what's going on. This is the nominal GDP chart you just saw a second ago. So why have I put this one up? Because I'd like to take a look at then nominal growth rate across the same time and see how much different the charts look and actually who's on the charts. Because while Luxembourg is #1 on the GDP per capita, when we look at growth rate across time, you see Timor as #1. In fact, if you look carefully, you're going to find the only country that's basically on both charts is going to be China. China happens to be on both charts. Otherwise, all these other ones are not on this one. And now, why would China be here but also be over here? Well, we can look at China's growth rate, especially over here in 2010 and at 2005. Now we're jumping years here, I know that, but that's the way that this particular chart was made. But remember, we said that we saw China had sort of an average growth rate of almost 9% per year. So that growth rate jumped their people way up. Now, in this case, it's 2011, so we really should come to this line and look above, to be honest. But the way that this chart copies over, we get to see more information, because the truth is that we'd want to see more information when we're talking about growth rates. In case you haven't noticed, you might have noticed that some countries don't have any information. Other countries were in negative growth rates. But would Timor really be the place you want to move to if you're looking for a really high standard of living? I mean, they've had a 16% growth rate in 2019, but that 16% growth rate might take you from the bottom, very bottom, to just one or two slots up. So growth rate tells us something. It says that these countries are on the move, but it may not tell us whether or not they have really high standards of living. That's why we might need a chart like this that tells us per person what the standard of living is. But these are countries that seem to be moving up, or at least have some movement up. And in some cases, they went from having negative growth rates to having positive growth rates. So they're doing something in that country that's helping them move their standard of living up. But there are other things we want to look at too. So one of the things that is very interesting is looking at what we call purchasing power. So purchasing power is basically a basket of goods. And that basket of goods, we look at the comparison of buying that same basket of goods from one country versus another country. Now in this case, we've got our real and our nominal, and you'll kind of notice that there really isn't a big difference between the real and the nominal as far as the order and who is where. What difference you see is basically in how much that parity is from one to another. But again, if we look at something like Qatar, you can see that they're going downward in both of them. And look at the dramatic difference here in nominal GDP. So looking in 2011 per person, this is how much they could spend within their country. Looking at today's prices in Qatar for that basket of goods, you can see the dramatic difference. So this country is on a downward slope. And if we were to be probably looking at their gross domestic product as far as growth rate is concerned, it's probably going to be in the negative because we are seeing a downward trend. Whereas you can see Ireland has this huge, it's almost doubled in that time period. And it doesn't really matter if we're looking at nominal versus real. But in real, notice that they haven't quite doubled in that time period. So again, real can quite often tell us a lot more about what the actual growth rate is, because over here, nominal, we're using current prices. You know, there may have been a downturn in prices basically in 2011 that has helped them, you know, look versus what the prices in 2019 are. And then we can also see perhaps here where we're measuring everything based on 2011 that we have a more equal viewpoint of what's going on. So we're going to always be looking at real versus nominal. We're going to be using different ones for different things. Real is going to help us better across time understanding what's going on because we're going to use a base year, where nominal is going to help us kind of understand what happened that year, you might want to say. So both of them give us a lot of information, but it gives us different types of information. And you might want to say, well, why would we need all this information? Well, because we really need multiple data points. We need multiple things to truly understand what's going on. One simple snapshot, like that very first image, is not really enough for us to understand what's going on within a country. After all, if we were only looking at the top 10, we wouldn't even see Timor in here, which seems to be doing something to help move it forward, to increase its standard of living, increase its productivity. Of course, one of the things we're always talking about is our growth rate, our annual growth rate. And so this chart is showing the United States, and we go from 1961 to 2019. Kind of interestingly, that if we average, which we did, about 2% growth rate in 35 years, basically the population doubles its income. Now, you can see right here the Great Recession in 2008. Our economy took a plunge. Basically, the world took a plunge in 2008 with the Great Recession. Not all countries, and we'll see that here in a second. You can also see there are a couple other times in the United States history where we had a negative growth rate, where we had dramatic drops going down since 1961. And we had a couple of time periods where we recovered really well. So here we have a negative, and up here we have a pretty strong positive. In fact, you might notice that normally when we have a negative, you come back with a strong positive. If you figured out what was going on and how to fix it, then generally the next year is going to look pretty good. But let's compare ourselves to our closest neighbors, Canada, and take a look at the difference in their growth rates versus ours. And you can see 2008, they have the same Great Recession sort of happening to them. But they also have trouble here where we didn't have trouble. They have trouble here and here where we had trouble. But notice we have trouble in the 70s, and instead they have great growth rate in the 70s. So again, we want to know, why is it that one country's growth rates are changing versus another country's growth rates? So let's take a look at, I can't get it to shift. There we go. Let's take a look at China. We were just talking about China a few minutes ago and how China has had this really phenomenal growth rate. Now, at first, when you look at this chart, it may look like the United States is doing, better than China in many areas, but that's kind of a false sense of looking at it, because what you have to look at is actually the scaling here. From then they go from 0 to 30. For us, we go from 0 to 10. So our scale is much smaller than their scale. So if I was to basically rescale the United States, and this is the United States now down here, and match basically their scaling, basically I took from here to here and squinched it down to be 10%. Notice we look much flatter than China does. And so you always have to be careful about scaling. Scaling can give us a false sense of what's going on. But one of the big things you might notice is that in 2008 in the United States, where we have a dip, they don't have a dip in 2008. They don't have the same Great Recession that we have at that time period. But they do have the hit of the 90s, and they do have the hit of the 78s. They don't have this particular hit. We see a small downturn here. But you can notice that they had a 20% growth rate here. They averaged over 10% many times. So when we looked at sort of an average of a 9% growth rate between 1990 and today, then yeah, you can see that their growth rate was much more phenomenal, you might want to say, overall than we were. They were far more productive. Now, there are all kinds of questions on whether or not there was playing with their currency and stuff like that, but that's not really what we're looking at right here. Let's take another look at another country, Singapore. Singapore is kind of an interesting country to look at, sort of a quiet country as far as the United States is concerned looking at it, but you could say they also have some pretty phenomenal growth rate. Now, they're basically do hit 15% right here. Now, they also have that hit in 2008, but they come back very strongly. There's their 10% line, and I keep reminding you that here's our 10% line. Basically, 7.5 is where we're at. But you can see that they really have been working pretty hard to increase their GDP from year to year. They have some pretty falls a few times, but they've been working pretty hard. But notice that in the last year or so that we're seeing some downward turns over in Singapore too, as far as the amount of growth is concerned. Well, let's take a look at Puerto Rico. Now, the reason I like to take a look at Puerto Rico, and yes, Puerto Rico is part of the United States. Some people tend to forget that. It is not a state, it is a territory, but it is part of the United States. They are U.S. citizens. They are considered part of this. But the one reason I like to bring this in is to show you this section right here. So our question would be is why did Puerto Rico have such a dramatic drop in 2005 when the entire United States did not have such a huge drop? And why is Puerto Rico still basically, although we can see right here it was going up, why was it below? Well, this is a good example of where we're going to look at changes in policies. So there was a huge change in policy that had occurred. It really sort of occurred throughout this time period. And that change in policy, in this case, it was a tax rate break that was changed, dramatically affected Puerto Rico's gross domestic product because many companies that had been doing business in Puerto Rico or had been doing manufacturing in Puerto Rico left Puerto Rico because they weren't getting those tax breaks. Now, Puerto Rico is beginning to recover. It's beginning to recover. And then, oh, guess what? Hurricane comes along and a couple of earthquakes come along. And so where they were trying to turn toward tourism, that basically takes a dive because people don't want to go there if there's basically a lot of infrastructure damage and they're having earthquakes. So yeah, people kind of question whether or not that's a vacation location. They begin to recover that, and it's very interesting to see what's going to happen in the pandemic. So here's a good example of where we can see a long-term negative GDP. Basically, they're producing or their productivity is less than it was before. But the question comes is, again, why does this occur here? And if you do a history of Puerto Rico and their economy, you can see that there's a big change in policies that occur at that time frame and has a direct effect on the economic growth of a country. So that's sort of what we want to look at. We want to look at why these changes occur and how do they shift. So let's take a little deeper dive into the reasons for changes. Paul Keurig is a Nobel laureate as far as economics is concerned. And in his 1994 book, he talks about productivity as being sort of everything in a way, because it is productivity that is directly linked to the standard of living for any type of community. So if we want to look at a more formal definition of productivity, we talk about this ratio of output volumes divided by the input volumes. Productivity, though, is so important that when we had our discussion about the 10 principles of economics, productivity was number 8. Productivity and standard of living are directly linked together, and it's all based on each unit of labor. So how does that play out? Well, here's our island, let's say, and our island has one resident named Chuck. Now, Chuck, he basically can normally get 1 fish per day, and so the island's productivity is 1 fish. But he moves to the middle of the island, and when he moves to the middle of the island and he goes to try to catch some fish, he can catch 2 fish per day. So the island's GDP, or its production, has increased by 2, but his standard of living has increased too, because instead of having 1 fish for dinner, now he's cooking up 2 fishes for dinner. And in fact, after a little while, Chuck moves over to another side of the island and he's been exploring, and he had noticed that there were palm trees there, and from the palm trees he makes, or he fashions is what I'm trying to say, a tool, a fishing rod. And now using that fishing rod, he's become even more productive. He now has 3 fish for dinner. So his standard of living has increased. So the island's GDP, its productivity rate, you might want to say, has gone from 1 fish to 2 fish to 3 fish. It depended on location. It depended on using tools. But this is a very simple measurement because we're talking about the unit of labor of only being Chuck. But of course, most countries have more than just 1 person who is working in that particular country. And so, the calculation of productivity is a little bit more complex, but this shows us our basic concept of productivity and how it is linked to standard of living, and that there are things that countries do that increase their productivity. So let's take a look at some of the specific things that countries can do to increase their productivity. There are 4 basic determinants, you might want to say, of productivity. So we can think about Chuck out there on the island. There are 4 things that really determined his increase in productivity. So the first one is sort of the physical structure. Now we call this capital We don't say the physical capital per worker, but basically the equipment used in production. So what he had in his case is that he had some palm trees and he was able to convert those palm trees into a fishing pole. And so he had basically equipment. When he had equipment, he was able to be more productive. When we look at human capital, so the knowledge, the skills that he accumulated, and he accumulated skills and knowledge as he went through the island and as he got better at fishing. And so his productivity went up. Then we look at the natural resources. Now, the one nice thing is that he had palm trees. That was a natural resource. He was able to use the lumber to produce something. He had fish in water, so he was able to get those things. He also had land, so he could make a fire because you notice he cooked all of his fish. So natural resources are huge as far as especially beginning economies. And then lastly, we say the technical knowledge. Now, you have to be careful because people think technology, they think computers, but technology is really a scientific application in the production of something. And when we say scientific application, we're really talking about what's the best way to produce something. So is it best to make it by hand? Is it best to make it by machines? Is this machine better than that machine? And so if we look at Chuck and our little island there, really the best production for him was the use of the fishing pole. And so he used that technology to increase his productivity. So these are sort of the four things that help us determine the different productivities from one country to another. We're going to look at 8 public policies, you might want to say, that can directly affect economic growth of a country. So the first one is what we call savings and investment. And what we're talking about here is that the more that we tend to put toward capital goods or toward the investment within a country, the more that we see an economic growth. So by what we mean by consuming less and investing more would be something such as we decide that we want to increase tourism. And so to increase tourism, we have to have some place for the tourists to go. And one of the places we have is perhaps a rainforest. Well, if I don't cut down the rainforest, then I can invest in processes that would bring in tourism. But that would mean that I might have to suffer a little bit right now because I could make a lot of money from lumber, but once I cut down that old growth tree, I'm not going to be able to bring tourists in who are interested in seeing old growth trees. So I might have to consume less lumber in order to create an investment, a capital investment that would bring in more revenue. You could also see this within a company as far as productivity is concerned. So perhaps a boat company who has lots of profit. So instead of giving the profit perhaps to the shareholders, instead they keep some of those profits and they buy new machinery. So their person who laminates now gets a brand new laminating machine. That person can now be more productive. So what we're talking about here is that as we invest in capital goods, and so these are those structures and equipment that we're talking about, we see an increase in production, but that may require a little savings and a little sacrificing. You can even look at this on an individual basis. If you right now are riding a bike to work, you might have to save some money. And if you have to save some money to buy a car, that would make you more productive because you could take a car, get there faster. It might also, though, mean that you're going to consume less Starbucks coffees or less extra movies or clothing or whatever it is that you tend to feel that you're maybe spending money you don't have to spend on it. So if we save a little bit more and put more into capital investments, we tend to find that there's an increase in production. Now, this is also, though, kind of an interesting one because if we already have a high level of capital investment, then adding more capital investment doesn't really increase productivity. So let's think back on this boat company here. The boat company has a person who laminates, and if he already has a good laminating machine, is buying a second laminating machine really going to increase his production? No, not really, because he could only laminate so much. 2 machines may not increase his productivity very much. But yet, we saw a chart earlier in this lecture where we saw countries like Myanmar and Vietnam who had these huge economic growth rates. Well, they are what we call the catch-up effect. Meaning is that they happen to be so low in production right now, so low generally in capital structure and equipment, that as they do invest in basic capital structures and equipment, they're going to see a tremendous increase in productivity. So maybe they're making boats, but they don't even have a laminating machine. They've been hand doing it, taking an iron out and taking plastic and ironing it. That takes a long time and you probably ruin a lot of things. So the fact that they even buy a laminating machine really increases their production a great deal versus a company that already has a laminating machine. Buying a second one doesn't increase their productivity very much. Along with that, we have to talk about investments from abroad. Now, this is always controversial because many small countries feel like they have to protect what's inside their borders, that including people from the outside might actually have a negative effect on their ability to grow because they feel like they may not have control. Well, in economics, we have not found that to be true. We've really found that as people from outside come and invest in these countries, at least to a certain level, that it actually increases the productivity of the individuals because it increases the amount of goods that they have to be productive with. So there are two types of investments that we need to understand: foreign direct investments and foreign portfolio investments. Now, a foreign direct investment is where a country or a company directly builds equipment or structure in another country. So a Japanese automaker decides to go to Mississippi and build a factory in Mississippi. That factory is owned by the Japanese company, but the economy in Mississippi is going to have the effect of the economic growth from the jobs and the other inputs that come in there. So that would be a foreign direct investment because they're coming directly into the company. But we could also look at perhaps an American company who produces some sort of electronics. And one of the things you need for electronics is silver. So they go to Africa where there is a company who already has a silver mine. Now, this company doesn't want to build their own mine. They want to invest in this company in Africa that already has a silver mine, because if they invest in that company is going to be able to perhaps buy new equipment that's going to make it more productive. Now, that would be a foreign portfolio investment because the U.S. company didn't, get its own rights to the mine and build its own mines and hire its own employees. No, what it did is invested in another company. So that's the foreign portfolio investment. But again, that tends to happen it tends to help that economy because now that company is able to buy new equipment, which is saving an investment, and they're able to increase the productivity of their particular unit. And so as they increase the productivity of their unit, that increases generally the overall economic wealth of their employees and so forth and so forth. Education is basically an investment in human capital. And as we invest in human capital, we know that we see an increase in productivity. Now, the problem for poor countries is that if they begin to invest in their citizens or in certain citizens, they suffer what we call brain drain. So let's say that I'm a poor country. I've figured out that I've got 15 really smart students. I pay for them to go to America to get educated because my expectations is that they're going to come back to this country and bring that education back here. But instead, 10 of the students decide to stay in America because they see they have better opportunities here in America than they do back in their home country. So now the country has sort of been drained of not only finances and money, but also of that education that they had invested in. You can also have people in situations, war quite often we see this, where some people who have specific talents or certain levels of brain power have the ability to get out of those countries and move to other countries, and those countries then get to use that knowledge, you might want to say, that the individual has. So investment in human capital has never been seen as a negative as far as economic growth is concerned. It becomes a negative if you can't keep the capital within your borders, though. With health and nutrition, oh, there has been so many studies on this, and we could do a whole basically class lecture on just how health and nutrition directly affects the productivity of a society. But it kind of makes sense. If your people are sick, then they're not going to be able to be very productive. If your people are suffering from diseases, they're not going to be able to come to work and be productive. If your people don't have enough nutrition to be strong enough to raise their kids, there's not going to be an increase in production. There's tons and tons of studies out there that show a direct correlation between these two items. It's one reason why trying to get people to stop smoking has actually increased production in many places. It pays to decrease the amount of smoking because it increases productivity. It is just a direct link. There's not much more I can say about that. With property rights and political stability, what we're really talking about is the protection of property rights through laws and courts. And the only way that those property rights are going to be able to be protected through the laws and courts is if there's political stability within a country. Now, what we mean by property rights is the right for someone not only to own, but to keep ownership and make basically decisions about the ownership of that property. So we'll go back to the company in the United States who invests in a company in Africa who has the right to mine silver. Now, if I go to a country in Africa where perhaps those rights to mine silver could disappear because of lack of political stability. A new leader comes in and says, okay, nobody now owns the right to the mines. It's all going to now be owned by the country. Well, I don't know if I want to invest in that particular place. Not only that, but if I'm a company and I've been owning that and I now suddenly don't own that, I don't have any property rights, why would I want to invest in that country? Why would I want to start a business in that country? I'd have a lot of fear. So property rights is one of those things that we see directly affects productivity, because if I can't have the right to my property, if somebody else has the right to take away my land because they want to use it for something else, then that means that I might not want to invest in those lands or those companies or that property or that whatever, because there's a lack of laws that will allow that to occur. Which then brings us to free trade. Now, what we're talking about is that trade will always improve economic being of a country's citizenship. We've talked about this since the very first lecture in macroeconomics. You can go back to the 10 principles of economics, and free trade is one of them. Now, when we say free trade, understand we mean free, honest trade. We're not talking about where things are illegally done. We're not talking about unbalanced trade. We're talking about free trade. So if I'm that small country who tends to want to keep all my stuff within my borders, I don't want investments from abroad, I can grow wheat. The problem is that I can only grow wheat. But if I took some of that extra wheat and I traded it to another country who could then perhaps give me equipment, or I could trade for equipment that I can't produce within my country, because if I'm only really making wheat, then how am I going to make steel to make saws, let's say? Trade is going to allow me to do that. So no matter what, the public policy that we have around trade absolutely affects the productivity, because it affects the items and the goods and services that you can have within a country. And last but not least is research and development. Basically, knowledge is what we consider to be a public good. It's a public good because as we have knowledge that is produced, it comes out to the public. So as we have developed cell phones, those cell phones come out to the public, other people begin to learn about it, other companies are created, other jobs are created, other avenues of productivity is created. So it's sort of a government's responsibility to make sure that research and development can occur freely within a country, because that public knowledge that is created through research and development will definitely increase productivity, which will increase the standard of living within a country. So these are 8 of them, but we're going to look at one a little bit more specifically in our next slide, and that's going to basically be about population growth. Looking at the countries that have the largest populations, you would think that China and India would have a huge advantage when it came to GDP per country, because they would have a large number of people to be productive. After all, workers produce things. And yet we know that when we looked at the nominal GDP per capita for 2019, Luxembourg was on top. And Luxembourg, well, they have less than 1 million people. Now, it is true that China was number 2, and we see the United States was number 3, but India, not on this chart. So what we know is that just because you have a large number of people, that means you have this large workforce to produce lots of goods and services. It also means that this large output that could be done has to be met with the ability for consumers to actually get goods and services. So a large population or a large output in production doesn't always mean a high standard of living for the typical citizen. So that kind of goes back to the slide we just talked about when we looked at different policies. But let's take one more look at population and some of the things that could affect economic growth. The last thing we're going to talk about is some of the factors that seem to affect the countries with low levels of economic development. Now, what you're seeing are the top 10 versus the bottom 10. And you may ask, why am I using nominal GDP? Well, I'm using nominal because remember, we like to use nominal when we talk about a snapshot. So I'm just talking about the snapshot for 2019. We're not looking at other years. We're just looking at 2019. And I also like using purchase power because purchase power is like a basket of goods. So the baskets of goods that you might buy in Singapore would be sort of the basket of goods that you might buy in Mali. So looking at this, what are some of the reasons or some of the factors that we have discovered? Well, one of them is basically low capital investment. Other countries and companies, they don't like going in to invest in these countries. And now normally there's a lot of different reasons. It's not usually just one factor. But because other countries don't want to come in and put in investment, and these countries are already in sort of peril, you might want to say, they don't have economic courses or any kind of economic new capital coming in for them to have those abilities to grow. So one of the big things that tends to keep them behind is low educational levels. With low educational levels, you're talking about certain types of jobs that can be handled, you might want to say. So if I have a group that is not literate, and you can see that in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a very low literacy rate compared to the world population, which, by the way, at the time of this recording is about 82 to 83% of adults. So with only 60% of people in sub-Saharan Africa being able to be literate, that means that there may be a lot of types of jobs that we wouldn't be able to bring to those particular areas because of the skill level that might be needed. So a lot of times when we have low education levels, we're looking at more service type jobs, and service type jobs are generally not world jobs, meaning is that they're at the local level. So your restaurant is at the local level. And that then again, doesn't really encourage a lot of investment. The other problem is poor health. When you have a large percentage of your population that lacks nutrition, you find that you have a large percentage of your population that, one, is going to die in their childhood, but number 2, they don't even make it to full height. They don't make it to full weight. They don't make it to full muscle capacity. And you tie that with a lack of vaccines, it also makes this population very vulnerable to getting diseases that the rest of the world basically doesn't get. So a lot of people are going to be sick. They also have a problem by not having clean water, which brings in more disease, and so on and so forth. So poor health would mean that I'm not going to have a group that's going to be very dependable to work with. We also have really high population rates. Now, in some of these countries, like Niger, we have the average woman having 6 children. In the United States, the average woman has less than 2 children. Madagascar, I believe the average is a little over 4 children at the time of this recording. So these birth rates are really high, and when you have really high birth rates, then you're going to find is that there are going to be a lot of people who are not in the workforce. Women produce a lot of economic good to populations, but if we have high birth rates, we may be seeing half of your population not producing, not adding to your economy. You also find that many of these countries have geographic disadvantage. If you really look at this list, not all of them again, because Madagascar, after all, is an island, but many of these are what we call landlocked. And when you're landlocked, it makes it much more difficult to have trade with countries outside. Water is one of the cheapest ways to move things back and forth. And if I don't have access to a port, then I have to have a ship bring something into another country and then ship it through that country to get it to my country. And so a lack of a port, a lack of the cheap, which is water is one of the cheapest ways to get things back and forth, really does disadvantage many countries. You also find that many of these countries have what we call restricted freedoms. Restricted freedoms meaning is that they have governments that perhaps do not have really good justice systems, or people aren't allowed to do things. And when we don't have freedoms, what happens is that it tends to correlate with lower income. That's because basically there's also tends to be rampant corruption. And when there's rampant corruption, people are discouraged in saving, and companies from outside are discouraged in investing. So that's another reason why there's low capital investment. Also, what you can find with restricted freedoms and rapid corruption is that governments quite often might want to take over particular companies. And so we talked about the fact that you have to have, the rights to your ownership. And if those rights to ownership are not guaranteed, or you feel that those rights to ownership may disappear, then I'm going to be less likely to come in and invest. And people are going to be less likely to want to start and put money and capital into a business because that might get taken over. And then finally, there is this thing called the legacy of colonization. Now, what's interesting is that when Europe went out to colonize, they looked at different areas differently. Some areas they looked at as places that they may want to stay. They might want to live forever. And when they found those particular places, like the United States or I don't know, things like Canada and New Zealand, they brought what they call inclusive institutions. And those they planned on staying. They always planned on being there. And so they're going to bring those institutions. But when they went to other countries, a lot of times in Africa and some in South America, they brought what they did not bring those inclusive institutions. They brought authoritarian governments. They were designed to basically just use the population, use the natural resources. And once that area was used up, they expected to leave. So this list that we have here, these are factors that tend to show low levels of economic development within certain countries. Now, some of these they're going to be able to fix, and some might be a little bit harder to fix. But what this lecture hopefully lets you see is some of the factors that really look at the productivity and the growth of countries. I hope you find this video helpful. If so, check out the other lectures that I have produced for my students that are open to anybody who needs to learn about economics. Until next time, keep learning.